Book 1, The Family, Section 11, of The Professor's House by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 1, The Family, Section 11. St. Peter had come in late from an afternoon lecture and had just lighted his kerosene lamp to go to work when he heard a light foot ascending the stairs. In a moment, Kathleen's voice called, "May I interrupt for a moment, Papa?" He opened the door and drew her in. "Kitty, do you remember the time you sat out there with your bee sting in your bottle? Nobody ever showed me more consideration than that, not even your mother." Kathleen threw her hat and jacket into the sewing chair and walked about, touching things to see how dusty they were. "I've been wondering if you didn't need me to come in and clean house for you, but it's not so bad as they report it. This is the first time I've called on you since you've been here alone. I've turned in from the walk more than once, but I've always run away again." She paused to warm her hands at the little stove. "I'm silly, you know, such queer things make me blue. And you still have Augusta's old forms. I don't think anything ever happened to her that amused her so much. And now you know she's quite sentimental about their being here. It's about Augusta that I came, Papa. Did you know that she had lost some of her savings in the Kinku Copper Company?" "Augusta? Are you sure? What a shame." "Yes, she was sewing for me last week. I noticed that she seemed depressed and hadn't much appetite for lunch, which you know is unusual for Augusta. She was ashamed to tell any of us about it because it seems she'd asked Louis's advice, and he told her not to invest in that company. But a lot of the people in her church were putting money into it, and of course that made it seem all right to her. She lost $500, a fortune for her, and Scott says she'll never get a cent of it back." "$500, murmured St. Peter. "Let me see it. $3 a day, that means 166 days. Now what can we do about it?" "Of course we must do something. I knew you'd feel that way, Father." "Certainly. Among us we must cover it. I'll speak to Rosamond tonight." "You needn't, dear." Kathleen tossed her head. "I've been to her. She refuses." "Refuses? She can't refuse, my dear. I'll have a word to say." The firmness of his tone and the quick rush of claret color under his skin were a gratification to his daughter. "She says that Louis took the trouble to speak to his banker and to several copper men before he advised Augusta, and that if she doesn't learn her lesson this time, she will do the same thing over again. Rosamond said they would do something for Augusta later, but she didn't say what. Leave Rosamond to me. I'll convince her." "Even if you can do anything with her, she's determined to make Augusta admit her folly, and it can't be done that way. Augusta is terribly proud. When I told her customers ought to make it up to her, she was very haughty and said she wasn't that kind of a sewing woman, that she gave her ladies good measure for their money. Scott thought we could buy stock in some good company and tell her we had used our influence and got an exchange, but that she must keep quiet about it. We could manage some such little fib. She knows so little about business. I know I can get the Dudleys and the Browns to help. We needn't go to the Marcelluses." "Wait a few days. It's a disgrace to us as a family not to make it up ourselves. On her account, we oughtn't to let Rosamond out. She's altogether too blind to responsibilities of that kind. In a world full of blunderers, why should Augusta have to pay scrupulously for her mistakes? It's very petty of Rosie, really." Kathleen started to speak, stopped, and turned away. "Scott will give $100, she said a moment later. "That's very generous of him. I'll give another, and Rosie shall make up the rest. If she doesn't, I'll speak to Louis. He's an absolutely generous chap. I've never known him to refuse to give either time or money." Kathleen's eyes suddenly brightened. "Why, Daddy, you have Tom's Mexican blanket. I never knew he gave it to you. I've often wondered what became of it." She picked up from the foot of the box couch a purple blanket, faded in streaks to amethyst, with a pale yellow stripe at either end. Oh yes, I often get chilly when I lie down, especially if I turn the stove out, which your mother says I ought always to do. Nothing could part me from that blanket." He wouldn't have given it to anybody but you. It was like his skin. Do you remember how horsey it smelled when he first brought it over and showed it to us? Just like a livery stable. It had been strapped behind the saddle on so many sweating cow ponies. In damp weather that smell is still perceptible. Kathleen stroked it thoughtfully. "Roddy brought it up from old Mexico, you know. He gave it to Tom that winter he had pneumonia. Tom ought to have taken it to France with him. He used to say that Rodney Blake might turn up in the Foreign Legion. If he had taken this, it might have been like the wooden cups that were always revealing Ami and Emile to each other." St. Peter smiled and patted her hand on the blanket. "Do you know, Kitty, I sometimes think I ought to go out and look for Blake myself. He's on my conscience. If that country down there weren't so everlastingly big." "Oh, Father, that was my romantic dream when I was little, finding Roddy. I used to think about it for hours when I was supposed to be taking my nap. I used to swim rivers and climb mountains and wander about with Navajos, and rescue Roddy at the most critical moments, when he was being stabbed in the back or drugged in a gambling house, and bring him back to Tom. You know, Tom told us about him long before he ever told you. You children used to live in his stories. You cared more about them than all your adventure books." "I still do," said Kathleen, rising. "Now that Rosamond has Outland, I consider Tom's Mesa entirely my own." St. Peter put down the cigarette he had just lighted with anticipation. "Can't you stay a while, Kitty? I almost never see anyone who remembers that side of Tom. It was nice, all those years, when he was in and out of the house, like an older brother. Always very different from the other college boys, wasn't he? Always had something in his voice, and his eyes. One seemed to catch glimpses of an unusual background behind his shoulders when he came into the room." Kathleen smiled wanly. "Yes, and now he's all turned out chemicals and dollars and cents, hasn't he? But not for you and me. Our Tom is much nicer than theirs." She put on her jacket and went out of the study and quickly down the stairs. Her father, on the landing, looked after her until she disappeared. When she was gone, he still stood there, motionless, as if he were listening intently, or trying to fasten upon some fugitive idea. End of Book 1, The Family, Section 11.